They claimed Earth violated combat law until a human smiled and said, "That's why we drafted our own." The folded paper was the first thing anyone noticed about her. Not the Navy uniform, not the worn leather folder she carried under one arm. The paper, small, square, folded into a shape that had no name in any galactic language. Dira held it between two fingers as she walked into the grand chamber of the Galactic Accord, and 3 different translation units flagged it as an unknown object. She set it on the corner of her table and sat down. The grand chamber was built to make individuals feel small. That was the design. Dark stone walls rose in smooth curves, broken only by inlaid lines of blue light that traced the borders of every surface like veins. The ceiling was open to space through a layered shield, and the neutral star outside burned at a comfortable distance, casting pale gold light across the floor. Around the central area, the delegate tiers rose in rings, each row higher and wider than the last, until the highest gallery disappeared into soft shadow. Today, every seat was filled. 217 species had sent someone to watch. The Vaukai delegation sat directly opposite the human table. There were 9 of them, gray-blue scaled, angular, dressed in deep red ceremonial armor with gold at the edges. Their lead prosecutor, Harren, did not look at Dira when she sat down. He was reviewing documents. He had been reviewing them for 3 days, and he reviewed them with the confidence of someone who already knew the ending. Roshan sat behind Dira at the secondary table. He was 26 and had been her aide for 8 months. He had never attended a tribunal before. He kept his hands flat on the table and his face still, because Dira had told him on the transport that this chamber reads body language in 43 different ways, and most of them were not human. The chamber president, a wide gray creature called a Solen, raised 2 of its 6 arms and the room went quiet. Harren stood. He spoke in Accord Standard, which was the closest thing the galaxy had to a shared language. His voice was calm and layered, the way Vaukai voices always were, like 2 sounds happening at once. He said that Earth had been contacted by the Accord 6 standard years ago. He said that Earth had been offered observer status, had accepted the basic charter, and had agreed in principle to operate within the rules of engagement that governed all recognized species during armed conflict. He said that Earth had then participated in the Torvan border dispute, which was a real conflict with real casualties, and that Earth's conduct during that conflict had been reviewed by 4 independent bodies. He paused. He said the results of those reviews were, to use the mildest available word, alarming. The first holographic panel opened above the chamber floor. It showed footage, battlefield footage from the Torvan system, tagged and annotated. Human forces deploying devices that emitted sustained sound frequencies calibrated to disrupt alien neural patterns without causing death. Human forces projecting false thermal signatures to draw enemy units into empty terrain. Human forces broadcasting communication on 17 different frequencies, including 3 that the opposing force had classified as internal-only channels. The gallery murmured. Harren moved to the next panel. It showed logistics data, human evacuation routes that moved civilians out of contested zones 48 hours before strikes were planned, routes that also happened to create visual cover for the advance of human ground units. Human field medics treating enemy wounded before their own supply lines were secured. Human soldiers offering food to prisoners before any formal surrender had been processed. The gallery was quiet now. Harren said that by his count, Earth's conduct during the Torvan conflict violated 29 separate articles of the Galactic Accord's rules of engagement. He listed them. It took 7 minutes. When he finished, he looked at Dira for the first time. She was watching him. She had been watching him the whole time. The folded paper was still in the corner of her table, and she had not opened the leather folder. Harren asked if the human delegation wished to respond to any of the evidence presented. Dira said, in clear accord standard, that she would like to request 3 additional days before presenting the human position. The gallery reacted, not loudly, but there were sounds. The Solin raised its arms again for quiet. Harren said there was no procedural reason to delay. The evidence was already submitted. Dira agreed that the evidence was submitted. She said she simply wanted time to ensure her response was complete. The Solin confirmed the extension, 3 days. Harren sat down. The Volkai beside him leaned in to say something, and he shook his head. He was not worried. He had 29 articles. He had footage, data, and the testimony of 3 allied species who had fought alongside Earth in the Torvan system and had, in their own words, found human behavior bewildering. Dira picked up the folded paper from the corner of the table. She turned it between her fingers once, then set it back down. Roshan leaned forward and whispered. He asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. She said the Volkai were very thorough. He asked if that was a problem. She said no. She said thorough people pay attention. That was exactly what she needed. The chamber was emptying around them, delegates filing out through dozens of exits, the murmur of 200 languages filling the air. The neutral star outside had shifted angle slightly. It still burned steady. Dira opened the leather folder for the first time and began to read. The station library did not stock human books. This was not unusual. The Galactic Accords archive held texts from 217 species, cross-referenced and translated into Accord standard, stored in a system that could retrieve any document in under 3 seconds. But physical books made from paper, written by hand or printed by machine, were a human thing. Most species had moved past physical storage media long before they reached the stars. Dira had brought her own. There were 11 of them in her quarters, stacked beside the small desk that faced the circular viewport. The neutral star was visible outside, steady and pale. She had arranged the books in no particular order, which Roshan had found strange until she explained that she did not read them in order. She read them based on what the moment needed. Tonight she had 3 of them open at the same time. Roshan stood near the wall, holding a data pad he was not reading, watching her work. She had been at the desk for 4 hours. She had eaten something at some point. There was an empty container near the books. He said her name quietly. She looked up. He asked her carefully how bad it had been. The history. The things she was using to build the case. He had read some of it in the briefing documents, but they had been summaries and summaries. He was learning, left out almost everything important. Dira looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to her desk and opened one of the physical books to a page near the middle. She did not read from it. She just looked at it. She said that humanity had been fighting itself for a very long time before it found the stars. She said the number was hard to make real because large numbers always were, but that in a single century, the one that ended about 80 years before first contact, somewhere between 150 million and 200 million people had died in conflicts that humans had started, escalated, and in many cases industrialized. She said that was not counting the smaller wars, or the ones that went undocumented. Roshan was quiet. She said that during that century, humanity had used every method imaginable: sound, gas, fire, deliberate starvation, psychological breaking. They had dropped burning material onto cities from aircraft. They had built facilities whose entire purpose was to process the deaths of human beings as efficiently as possible. He said he had not known it was that. She said most people did not hold the full weight of it at once. It was too heavy to carry in one piece. You had to set most of it down and only pick up what you needed. She closed the book. She said that after the worst of it, after the part that everyone agreed was the lowest point, a group of humans sat down and wrote a document. Not a peace treaty, not a political agreement, A codex, a set of rules governing how war was to be conducted, not how to end it but how to fight it, in a way that preserved the possibility of a world existing after it was over. She pulled a single bound document from the bottom of the stack on the desk. It was thick. The cover was plain. The edges were worn and the binding had been repaired at least twice. She held it toward Roshan. He took it carefully, as if it might mean something specific to hold it wrong. He looked at the cover. He looked at the date on the inside page. He did some arithmetic in his head and looked up. He asked if that date meant what he thought it meant. She said yes. It predated first contact by 63 years. He said then the Accord did not know it existed. She said the Accord had never asked. When Earth was brought into observer status, the intake questionnaire asked whether Earth had a governing body, a unified military command structure, and a defined territorial boundary. Earth had answered yes to all three and provided the relevant documentation. No one had asked whether Earth had its own rules of war. She said it had not seemed like the kind of question anyone would forget to ask. Roshan set the codex back on the desk, gently. He asked how many articles were in it. She said 412. He stared at her. She said the first 104 were written in the original drafting period. The rest had been added over time, as new forms of conflict emerged and old rules needed refining. The most recent edition had been written 11 years ago, specifically addressing conduct in conflicts involving non-human combatants, because even before reaching the stars, humans had started planning for the possibility. He asked who had written that edition. She said a woman who had spent 30 years in conflict zones and wanted to make sure, if humans ever met someone else out there, they would not make the same mistakes twice. Outside the viewport, the neutral star had not moved. It did not move. That was the point of a neutral star. It burned at the same temperature for everyone. Roshan looked at the stack of books, then at the codex, then at Dira. He asked what the Volkai were going to say when they saw it. She said they were going to be very uncomfortable, because the thing that made people most uncomfortable was not being accused of breaking the rules. It was discovering that someone else had been following better ones all along. She picked up the folded paper from the desk, turned it once in her fingers, and set it back down. She said they should both get some sleep. Saru did not eat the way most species ate on the station. Most delegates used the main refectory, a wide open hall on the middle ring where food processors had been programmed with several hundred dietary profiles. Saru brought his own food in small containers from home, things that smelled like warm earth and something faintly sweet, and he ate them alone in the side alcove near the lower observation corridor, because the light there was the same color as the light on his home world in the late afternoon. He had been doing this for 4 days. On the 5th day, someone sat across from him. The delegate was from a species called the Wen, small and pale, with fingers that moved constantly even when the rest of them was still. The Wen delegate said his name was Foss, and that he had been watching Saru and wanted to ask him something. Saru said he could ask. Foss said that Saru's people, the Menti, had fought alongside the humans in the Torvan conflict. He said everyone in the gallery knew this, but that no one had spoken to Saru directly, which Foss found strange, because Saru was the only person in the chamber who had actually been there. Saru said that was true. Foss asked what it had been like. Saru was quiet for a moment. He looked at his food. He picked up one of the small containers, set it back down without eating from it, and then looked at Foss directly. He said the first thing the humans did when they arrived in the Torvan system was send a broadcast on open frequency, not to the Allied forces, not to the Accord observers, to the opposing force. The message said that a ceasefire window of 72 hours was being offered for civilian evacuation from the 3 contested settlements, and that during this window, human forces would not advance, would not fire, and would not conduct any surveillance operations within 200 kilometers of those settlements. Voss asked if the opposing force accepted. Saru said they did not respond at all. They used the window to resupply 2 forward positions. Voss said then the humans gained nothing. Saru said that approximately 9,000 civilians left the contested settlements during that window. He said the humans had known the opposing force would use it to resupply. Their own intelligence had flagged it. They had broadcast the ceasefire anyway. Voss was still. Saru said that on the 4th day of active engagement, his unit had been caught in a flanking movement near the second settlement. 3 Menti soldiers were wounded, one seriously. Before his own field team had stabilized the serious case, 2 human medics appeared from a direction that should have been contested ground. He asked them later how they had gotten there. They said they had gone around. He asked how long that had taken. They said about 4 hours. They had moved at night through terrain his own commanders had marked as impassable. He said one of them had been injured doing it. A cut across the forearm from something in the dark. She had wrapped it herself and not mentioned it until the Menti soldier was stable. Voss said that sounded like a significant personal risk for a soldier from another species. Saru said he had asked her about it. He had asked why she had come that way in the dark through bad terrain for soldiers she did not know. He paused. He said she had looked at him like it was not a complicated question. She said that his people were hurt and she knew how to help, and the terrain being difficult was not a reason not to go. Voss sat with that for a moment, his fingers slowed. In a different part of the station, in a small analysis office near the Vorkai delegation suite, Asen was not sleeping. He had a screen open and 3 secondary panels running beside it. He was looking at the human military logs from the Torvin conflict, the same logs Heron had submitted as evidence. Heron had submitted them to show the violations. Asen had been asked to cross-reference them against Accord articles to strengthen the prosecution's closing argument. He had been doing this for 2 days. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the way that evidence was wrong when it had been altered. Wrong in the way that a calculation was wrong when it kept producing an answer you did not expect. Every human action in the logs had a number beside it, a reference number. He had initially assumed these were internal unit codes, the kind of administrative tagging that military organizations use to track resource allocation. But the format was inconsistent with any known human administrative system. The numbers were not sequential. They repeated. Some appeared dozens of times across completely different types of operations. He pulled up a cross-reference search and compared the numbers against known human documentation. Nothing matched in the Accord archive. He tried a broader search, including pre-contact Earth documents that had been uploaded during the intake process. Most of them were governmental and administrative. He filtered by military category. One result. A document listed under supplementary intake materials, filed 63 years before Earth's first contact, uploaded automatically as part of a bulk historical archive transfer that no one had apparently reviewed in detail, because it was categorized under historical texts and given no active classification. He opened it. The title was plain. The date was old. He checked the article numbers in the human military logs against the articles in the document. They matched. Every single one. He sat very still for a moment. Then he checked the filing date again. Then he checked it a 3rd time. He pulled up Heron's contact channel and stopped with his finger over the connect button. He thought about what Heron would say. He thought about the closing argument Heron was already writing. He closed the channel. He saved the document to his own personal archive and sat looking at the screen for a long time. The chamber was full again on the 3rd day. It was fuller than it had been for the opening session. Word had moved through the station the way word always moved through places where many different kinds of people were waiting, quietly and quickly, and to everyone at once. By the time the session was called to order, the upper gallery had standing delegates, and at least 4 species had sent additional observers who had no official standing, but stood in the access corridors anyway, watching through the wide doorways. Dira walked in carrying the leather folder and the codex. She set them both on the table. She did not sit down. She stood behind the table and looked at the chamber for a moment, the way someone looks at a room before they begin something that cannot be undone. The Salun raised its arms. Harun was already seated composed, his closing documents arranged in front of him. He had written a strong conclusion. He had practiced it. He was ready for whatever she said. Dara began with a question. She asked the chamber how many of the species represented had, at any point in their history, fought a war against members of their own species. The chamber was quiet. Delegates looked at each other. A few looked at their historical data systems. After a long pause, 3 species raised formal acknowledgement flags. Out of 217. Dara thanked them. She said that humanity had fought internal wars for approximately 12,000 years. She said that number was not a boast and not a confession. It was a context. She said that every rule, every article, every clause in the document she was about to present had been written by people who had already made every possible mistake and were trying to make sure they never made them again. She opened the codex. She said she would now address each of the 29 articles cited by the prosecution. Harun's posture shifted slightly. She began with the psychological disruption devices, the sound frequency emitters that the prosecution had called a form of torture. She cited Article 7 of the Human Conduct of War Codex, which permitted the use of non-lethal sensory disruption under specific conditions, that the effect be temporary and fully reversible, that no device be calibrated to cause permanent neurological damage, and that a medical assessment of the target species be completed before deployment to confirm reversibility. She held up the field documentation from the Tuvan operation. The assessment had been completed. The effect had lasted between 4 and 7 hours. Full recovery had been confirmed in all documented cases. She moved to the false thermal signatures. Article 14, Civilian Protection Clause. When conventional engagement would require forces to advance through populated terrain, misdirection of enemy attention toward unpopulated terrain was not only permitted but required, provided no civilian was placed in the path of the misdirection. The Tuvan operation logs showed the terrain chosen for the false signatures had been confirmed empty before deployment. She moved to the intercepted frequencies. Article 22. Deception operations were explicitly authorized when the alternative was a higher casualty engagement. The 3 frequencies the humans had used were not chosen arbitrarily. They were chosen because using them reduced the estimated casualty count on both sides by approximately 40%. The estimate was documented. It was in the logs. The gallery was very quiet. She kept going. The evacuation routes that doubled as cover for troop movement. Article 31, which stated that military planning must account for civilian safety as a primary operational factor, not a secondary one, and that any incidental military benefit from a civilian protection action was acceptable provided the civilian protection was genuine and not staged. The Tuvan civilian count was documented. 9,412 people. The enemy wounded treated before human supply lines were secured. Article 55, which stated that medical care for combatants was not conditional on military status, species, or affiliation, and that a soldier who could provide care and did not provide care was in violation of the Codex regardless of the tactical situation. She set the Codex down on the table. She did not slam it. She set it down carefully. She said that she understood why the prosecution had reached its conclusions. The rules of engagement governing the Galactic Accord were written approximately 300 years ago by species who had only ever experienced war as an external event, a conflict between different peoples across different territories, with a clear separation between combatant and civilian, between enemy and non-enemy. Those rules assumed a clean geometry of war. She said that the human conduct of war codex had been written by people for whom that clean geometry had never existed, people who had gassed their own cities, who had bombed their own civilians, who had marched their own neighbors into mass graves, people who had learned, at enormous cost, that the rules of war had to account for the worst version of what war could become, not the best version. She said the 29 articles cited by the prosecution were not violations. They were compliance with a more complete framework. She said Earth had not ignored the laws of war. She said Earth had arrived with better ones. The silence in the chamber lasted long enough that the pale gold light from the neutral star shifted almost imperceptibly across the floor. No one moved. No translation unit chirped. The Salon sat with all 6 arms lowered. Harun looked at the codex on the table. He looked at it the way a person looks at a thing that has changed the shape of the room without making a sound. The recess broke the silence, but not the tension. Delegates moved into the corridors and side chambers and the station's common areas, and they did what delegates always did when something unexpected had happened in a formal session. They argued. They argued with their own teams, with delegates from allied species, with anyone who would stand still long enough to receive an opinion. The Verka delegation went directly to their private chamber. Harun sat at the head of the table and said nothing for approximately 4 minutes, which was, for a Verka, an extremely long silence. The others waited. One of them, a senior aide named Farun, began pulling up precedent cases. Another tried to contact the Accord's legal archive for any recorded instance of a non-Accord framework being submitted as a defense in a conduct tribunal. There was no precedent. The archive search returned empty. Harun said finally that the document was irrelevant. It was an internal human text. It had no standing under Accord law. The tribunal was governed by Accord articles, not by whatever Earth had written for itself before it joined the galaxy. Farun said that was technically accurate, but asked whether the chamber president would accept that argument given that the document predated Earth's contact with the Accord, which meant Earth had been operating under it independently and in good faith before they had ever agreed to anything else. Harun said good faith was not a legal category. Farun said it was, actually. It was Article 3 of the Accord's own intake charter, the clause governing species admitted under observer status, and the expectation that their conduct would be evaluated in context of their own established norms. Harun looked at him. Farun said he was sorry. He had found it while cross-referencing. In the gallery corridor, Sarah was speaking to 4 different delegates at once. Word had spread that he had first-hand experience from the Tuvan conflict, and people who had been quiet in the chamber were considerably less quiet in a corridor. A tall Vul delegate with bright orange photosensitive patches along her arms asked him whether the human Bahavike he described was typical or exceptional. Sarah said in his experience it was consistent, which he found more interesting than if it had been exceptional, because exceptional meant one unusual individual and consistent meant a pattern, and patterns came from somewhere. A smaller delegate from a species called the said that what bothered him was the sound devices. He said the idea of a weapon calibrated specifically to the neurology of the target species felt deeply invasive, more personal than a conventional weapon, somehow. Sarah thought about this. He said that was an interesting way to see it. He said he had asked the human commander about the devices during a debrief. The commander had said that the alternative was a conventional engagement in a terrain that would have required clearing buildings one by one, and that based on their estimates that would have killed between 40 and 90 of their own people, and between 200 and 400 of the opposing force. She had said the device gave everyone a headache and a few hours of confusion, and then they woke up and went home. The delegate said that sounded like the kind of calculation, that was easy to make from a distance. Sarah said the commander had made it from 40 mucks behind the front line, not from a ship, and had been present when the affected soldiers were processed. He said she had also ensured that every affected combatant received water and medical assessment before they were transferred to holding, which was not required by any rule he knew of at the time, and which she had apparently done because she said waking up confused and alone in enemy hands was bad enough without being thirsty. The Urin delegate was quiet. In the analysis office, Asen had not left. He had been in the same chair for 18 hours, minus the time it had taken to retrieve food from the processing unit down the corridor. He had read the Human Conduct of War Codex 3 times, not the summary, the full text, 412 articles. Some of them were dense and procedural. Some of them were short and plain in a way that was more striking than the long ones. Article 88 said, "A combatant who is no longer able to fight is no longer a combatant." Article 91 said, "Surrender is a right, not a concession." Article 103 said, "The conduct of war shall always account for the war ending." He had stopped at that one for a long time. He was still thinking about it when his door opened, and Harren stood in the frame. Harren looked at the screens. He looked at the codex open on the secondary panel. He looked at Asen. He said he needed Asen to tell him what he had found. Asen said he had found the document in the Accord archive, uploaded as part of the human intake materials 63 years before first contact. He said it had not been reviewed or flagged by intake staff because it was categorized as historical text, not active legal framework, and no one had been looking for it. He said the reference numbers in the human military logs matched the codex articles precisely and consistently across the entire operational record. There was no possibility of coincidence. The humans had been following the codex in real time, during the conflict, citing specific articles in their own logs as operational justification. Harren said nothing. Asen said there was one more thing. He pulled up Article 103 and turned the screen toward Harren. He said this one had been written 80 years ago by a human who had fought in one of the worst wars in their history, and then spent the rest of his life trying to explain what he had seen. He said the man had written 400 words of preamble that the drafting committee had reduced to one sentence for the final text. Harren read it. "The conduct of war shall always account for the war ending." He stood there for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, that Asen should come to the afternoon session, and that if the chamber president opened the floor for testimony, Asen should speak. The afternoon session began with a procedural request from the Volkai delegation. Harren stood and said that the defense had submitted a document of uncertain standing under Accord law, and that the prosecution moved to have the Human Conduct of War Codex declared non-binding and inadmissible, as it had no recognition from any Accord body and had not been submitted during Earth's intake process as an active legal framework. The Solen asked the human delegation to respond. Dira said that Earth had submitted the codex during intake as part of a bulk historical archive transfer, and that she was happy to provide the submission timestamp, which predated Earth's signing of the Observer Charter by 4 months. She said the Accord had accepted the materials without reviewing them, which was the Accord's own administrative decision and not Earth's responsibility. She said she also wished to note that the Accord's own rules of engagement had not been formally recognized by any external body when they were first written. Recognition was something that came after. First, something had to exist. The Solen noted both positions for the record. Then it did something no one in the chamber had expected. It asked if there were any delegates who wished to offer testimony from direct experience of the Torvan conflict. Saru raised his flag immediately. So did 2 Vel observers who had been in the corridor. And from the upper gallery, a young Volkai in a plain dark gray uniform raised his hand. The chamber noticed. Several delegates turned. A few of the Volkai in the main delegation looked up at him. Harren did not turn around. Saru spoke first. He covered what he had told Foss in the alcove, briefly and plainly. He said he had fought beside humans for 41 days. He said at no point had he seen them act without regard for what came after the fighting. He said that was the clearest way he could describe it. They always seemed to be thinking about what came after. The Vel observers spoke about the ceasefire window and the civilian numbers. Then the Solen turned to the upper gallery. Asen walked down to the floor level. He was shorter than most of the people at the central tables, and he stood very straight. He said he was an analyst attached to the Volkai prosecution team, and that he had found something in the Accord archive that he believed the chamber needed to know. He presented the filing record, the timestamp. The reference number matches across the entire operational log. He said it clearly and without editorializing, because the facts did not need decoration. The chamber was very still. Harren sat with his hands on the table and did not move. One of the delegates from a species called the Dorasi, a quiet people who rarely spoke in open session, raised a formal inquiry flag. Their representative, an older female with pale silver skin and careful eyes, said she had a question for the human delegation. She asked Dira directly, had humanity written this codex because they believed they would one day go to war with other species, or because they had gone to war with themselves so many times that they felt they had no choice? The chamber waited. Dira said it was the second one. She said no one had written the codex thinking about the stars. They had written it standing in the wreckage of their own world, looking at what they had done to each other, and deciding that if it was ever going to happen again, it would happen with rules that kept the damage from becoming total. She said the people who wrote it had no idea what was out in the galaxy. They just knew what was inside human beings, and they had tried to write something that held the worst of it back. The Dorasi representative sat with that for a long time. Then she raised a second flag, a different color, the one that signaled a formal motion. She moved that the Galactic Accord initiate a joint review of its rules of engagement, using the Human Conduct of War Codex as a reference document. The vote was called. 163 in favor, 41 opposed, 13 abstentions. The Volkai delegation did not vote. The Solen announced the verdict on the original charges shortly after. All 29 articles dismissed. Earth had operated under a recognized and documented internal framework, filed with the Accord in good faith prior to active engagement. No violation had occurred. The gallery did not cheer. This was not a place for cheering, but there was a sound, a kind of settling, like a room full of people releasing a breath they had not known they were holding. Dira closed the leather folder. In the corridor outside the main chamber entrance, an hour later, the lights were lower and the station was returning to its ordinary quiet. Dira and Roshan walked toward the docking ring. Through the long viewport that ran the length of the corridor wall, the neutral star burned at the same steady temperature it had maintained for 4 billion years. Roshan asked if she had expected it to go this way. She said she had hoped for it. He asked what she had expected. She said she had expected to win the legal argument and lose the room. She said she had packed for a longer stay. Footsteps behind them, they did not stop walking. Harren's voice came from 3 meters back. He said her name, not her title, her name. They stopped. He walked toward them and stopped at a distance that was not close. He did not look at Roshan. He looked at Dira. His gray-blue face was difficult to read, as Volkai faces always were, but something in the set of his jaw was different from the chamber. He said he had read Article 103 that afternoon. He said he wanted to know who wrote it. Dira said it was a soldier, a man who had survived a war that killed 40 million people and then spent the rest of his life trying to explain what that had cost. Harren said the man had reduced it to one sentence. Dira said he had written 400 words first, and the drafting committee had kept only the sentence. She said he had agreed to the cut. He said one sentence was harder to ignore. Harren said nothing for a moment. Then he said he would be submitting a formal response to the joint review motion. He said the Volkai would participate. He walked past them toward the opposite end of the corridor. Roshan watched him go and then looked at Dira. She was already walking again, the leather folder under her arm and the folded paper in her hand, turning it once between her fingers. He asked what they did now. She said they went home, and then they sent the Accord a very long document. Outside, the neutral star burned on.